Welcome to Abundant Housing LA's Housing 101. My name is Luke Klipp. I'm our volunteer housing LA education director. I come at this as a volunteer, but as someone who's also been involved in local politics for a number of years. Primarily, my domain is in transportation policy from a professional capacity, but I am really interested and do a lot of work in the housing space. I just want to be clear as we dive into this. Housing is an inordinately complicated set of policy topics, issues, challenges, and really, truly, there's so much that we could cover that you could fill a full curriculum of semesters worth of material and still have so much more to cover. So in the 2 hours that we have this afternoon to talk about housing, we're going to touch on a number of things. We're not going to really get to do a deep dive on any one of them. There's a lot of stuff that we can cover, right? Really, the intention behind this is to sort of set the table. For a lot of us who come to this conversation around housing, we have our own sort of individual experiences about what that is, what it means to build housing, to preserve housing, and really this is to kind of help us understand, like, how did we get into the situation where we are today, and what are the implications associated with that? So very much the agenda today is really focusing on our history and how our history shapes our present. We will spend a little bit of time talking about our region and something specific to Abundant Housing LA's theory of change and policy approaches, and then some ways you get involved, and then we'll have time for questions at the end. I said, we all come to this from perspectives. This is a photo of St. Joseph's Hospital in Superior, Wisconsin. Superior is on just the northern edge of the state of Wisconsin. This hospital was built in the 1930s and shuttered in the 1970s. I share this because my family lived in this hospital for a year. When it was an abandoned hospital, we were housing insecure, almost homeless, and many of us have experienced housing insecurity or even homelessness. And I share that because no matter who we are, where we come from in life, we have our own experiences with housing. Housing is an incredibly personal thing for many of us. And so the housing conversation often is not just something we can look at as a strict, like, oh, here's the policy, here's the data, because we each one of us come at this from a very personal perspective. So I just think it's important for us to acknowledge that, to be open to that and mindful of that as we dive into this conversation. There's a couple core central ideas that are going to shape and frame our Housing 101 discussion today. The first one is that banning multifamily housing results in a number of significant challenges: wealth and opportunity disparities, unaffordable rents, homelessness. I should add on this, it determines people's lifetimes, how long they get to live. And when I use the terminology banning multifamily housing, that's actually sort of my turn of phrase, but it's more commonly referred to as single-family zoning. And single-family zoning is a category of zoning, which we'll learn a little bit more about in just a little bit, where you can only build one house on a piece of land, no matter how big that piece of land is. If it's a quarter acre, an acre, 2 acres, whatever it is, whatever that single parcel of land is, you can build one and only one house. Whereas on multifamily zoned property, you can build multiple homes, 2, 3, 4, whatever the zoning allows. You could also, on multifamily housing, build only one home. But you cannot build multifamily housing where we've zoned for single family. And we'll see as we go through this why that's so significant. The second really core central idea of this presentation is that our housing policy is systemically racist, and then I put in a parenthetical, and has been for a very, very long time. Not all time necessarily, but it has been for a very, very long time. And what that means is that there's not like a policy to say, well, that's the racist policy, or an organization or person say that's the racist person or the racist organization. It is to say that the outcomes generated by our system of housing policy are systemically racist. And we can see that in very specific ways, where the only thing that can be pointed to empirically to explain certain things that occur in our housing policy is race. Only race, nothing else. And that is very much true in many ways that we can see this as we go through this conversation. The third core central idea that we really have to hold on to in this conversation is distinguishing between opinions that are individual opinions and institutional opinions. This is something I think is just really important to acknowledge. People have opinions about things. We all have opinions about things. But if the systems in place are something entirely different, then your or my opinion about that thing, which is so different from the system, is just an individual opinion. We can say it all we want, but systematically it doesn't have any meaning or value because the system is the institutional opinion that is in place that determines what is and isn't of value. And this map here is sort of the city of LA, sort of core, it's not the core, but south of the Santa Monica Mountains, into South LA, and it's color-coded pink and blue. This is all property in the city of LA, in this area of Los Angeles, that is zoned for housing, that is zoned residential. And on this map, the areas that are pink are indicating they're zoned for single-family housing, and the areas that are blue are zoned for multifamily housing. In other words, in the areas that are pink, there are apartment bans, multifamily housing bans. In the areas that are blue, they allow multifamily housing. They allow multiple families to either rent properties, individual properties on a single piece of land or to purchase. And that is an institutional opinion that in the city of LA, across the entire city, 75% of our residentially zoned land is zoned for single family zoning, is zoned as a multifamily housing ban. And when you think about that, you also have to realize, like, you have to define what a family is. We actually have a family defined in our zoning code because we determine what qualifies as a family for multifamily and single family housing. And really what it comes down to is having a single kitchen and not having multiple rooms rented out. So the zoning code actually has to define what a family is. I think a couple other things we just sort of want to be clear about. This is two different things that I've just sort of juxtaposed to each other. The one on the left is an advertisement from a local blog, which is a realtor advertising, homes in some of these neighborhoods in LA where, we're seeing a lot of gentrification. And the realtor is like, this is the great place, to go and start to, basically continue to buy up what's available there. Prices are rising, whatever. All signs point to these communities. The list of cities and on the right is cities that were a list that was put together by the Biden administration regarding Afghan refugee resettlement, where they basically said, look, these are the top communities that we would recommend for Afghan refugees who have fled the country after the United States left after our 20-year-long engagement overseas. And the Biden administration said, here's the cities that we think are the most viable for Afghan refugees. You'll note there's not a single one in the state of California. And I think that's important to acknowledge here because primarily what they're saying is you can't afford. If you're an Afghan refugee, you can't afford a home in California. And I think we can have either the left, where homes are the home prices are escalating and accruing to nest eggs, or we can have on the right where home prices are maybe more stable, largely owing to more housing having been created. But it's really difficult to do both of these things. It's very difficult to have homes being such a rapidly escalating price point that they're this huge nest egg for people, and also that we're communities that can be welcoming and safe spaces for people who are fleeing violence overseas or whatever else the case may be. And another and final core central idea here, this is an op-ed that was just published yesterday in the LA Times, where basically the author is pointing out that the city of LA, the LA region, we pioneered residential segregation. We're the pioneers for residential segregation for the United States, right here in Southern California. And how does that play out? So there's a quote here that I've provided from a book called Bound for Freedom, Black Los Angeles and Jim Crow America. The now classic view holds that from the late 1880s to about 1910, African Americans found Los Angeles to be a fairly open city, residentially speaking. But after 1910, Real estate restrictions on blacks increased and were difficult to surmount. As the historian Lawrence de Graaf wrote, African Americans could and did live throughout the city and were much less concentrated in any one area in 1890 and would be after 1910. Or in the words of Charlotta Bass, the Negro settlers who were the first arrivals bought land and built beautiful homes in all sections of the city free from restrictions, but then came the Southern whites, and blacks faced the old terror of racial hatred they had tried to forget. So this is to really sort of lay the table here as we dive into our housing history. I'm offering a timeline. You can see it. We're going to go through a lot of these things, but you don't need to memorize anything on here. But I want to call out three very clear, distinct things. And frankly, I think the brown bar, I've got brown bar, red bar, and orange bar here. I actually think the brown bar should kind of be extended further to the left than it is there on this timeline. But basically, the way you would describe it is the brown bar is basically a period of time when we had racially restrictive covenants, deed restrictions that were explicitly racial and were perfectly legal. The red bar is a period of time where we had redlining, which we will be talking a fair amount about redlining and its impact on our communities. And then the orange-ish bar is a period of time where we engaged in rapid and significant downzoning across the entire region, where we went from zone capacities of significantly more than our population to zone capacities that were basically capped out at the people who were already here. And so these three things are really key focus points throughout this presentation as we go through our housing history. Starting with Buchanan v. Worley in 1917, which was a Supreme Court decision that said you cannot discriminate on the basis of race in zoning code. So the Supreme Court said for the city of Louisville, which had zoning that said here's the black community and here's the white community, the Supreme Court said no, that's not legal. You cannot do race segregation by zoning. However, people found another way to do it. And here in LA, we were, as that article said from yesterday in the LA Times, the pioneers. To ensure that, so LA was one of the first cities to adopt single-family zoning as a zoning code, and these were homes that were marketed to and restricted to white households. So on the left-hand side, you see a brochure from Hollywoodland. We've all seen the Hollywood sign. That sign is an advertisement, or when it was first built, was an advertisement for Hollywoodland, a residential subdivision built in the teens and 20s. And this brochure advertises you can protect your family by procuring at today's prices a home place in the hills of Hollywoodland secured by fixed and natural restrictions against the inroads of metropolitanism. Now let me decode that for you for a minute, okay? A natural restriction, that's sort of the distance from downtown, that's the hills. You have to have a car, and these cars are starting to come into play here in LA. But the fixed restrictions, that is, nobody but white folks can buy a home here. And nobody but white folks can buy a home whether it's a piece of land where they're going to build a home or a home that's already been built that's being resold. This is a whites only community. Now, much cuter about this in the brochure for Hollywoodland than Eagle Rock, which just comes out and says it on the second to bottom last line there. The residents of Eagle Rock are all of the white or Caucasian race. Now, to ensure that restrictive covenants could be enforced, the LA Realty Board, which was founded in the early 1900s, financed a case that set a national precedent in 1919 when the California Supreme Court ruled that an African American could buy a covenanted home but could not live in it. So the California Supreme Court said these deed restrictions here were perfectly legal because even though they said you couldn't occupy the home, you could, if you were a black person, you could still buy a home, you just couldn't live in the home. So we have this deed restriction approach, these covenants that are just exploding across the landscape, synchronous with single-family zoning, exploding across the landscape. And in 1926, the U.S. Supreme Court also says these covenants perfectly legal. So it's not just California, this is happening all across the country 100 years ago. And in Los Angeles, in the early 1920s, we are seeing an explosion of construction of new housing. In fact, in 1923, in 1 year of 1923, we built almost 44,000 new homes in a single year in the city of Los Angeles. However, this was also a time when 1,400 subdivisions were created in just 2 years, where race restrictions across all of those subdivisions were the norm. So all of those, on this chart here, you see the black bars, that's single family housing. That is all whites only housing being built across the city of Los Angeles. Now, as a point of contrast, we hear a lot today about, oh, there's so much housing construction happening right now. This is at the same scale, the last 40 years of housing construction in the city of LA. Now they're flipped. The blue tips on these bars on the right-hand side, that's single-family housing construction in the city of LA, and multifamily is everything below it. But you'll note that even in just the last decade, we really didn't even do nearly as well as we did in the 20s, let alone 30s, let alone the 20s, in terms of housing construction from a century ago. There was even a period in the 1990s where we went almost the entire decade with housing construction at levels that were about the same as we saw in the Great Depression, in the heart of the Great Depression in the 1930s. So let's sort of walk through where we've gone, where things have progressed through time since we really started seeing this explosion of housing construction across LA in the 20s. The Great Depression, as many of us know, in the early 1930s, was this huge moment in time for our country. And we saw a proliferation of what were called or nicknamed Hoovervilles on the upper left-hand corner, which today we would call a homeless encampment, right? But they were called Hoovervilles. So many hundreds of thousands of Americans who were unable to afford a home. Housing wasn't a national thing at the time. It was all done locally. There was no federal infusion of dollars or anything into this. And it was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who changed that as part of his New Deal with the passage of the National Housing Act in 1934. That bill created the Federal Housing Administration, whose Federal Home Loan Bank Board empowered another group, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, to determine levels of risk associated with federally backed mortgages. The federal government said, we're going to come in, we're going to provide a massive infusion of resources, but we need to know that we're doing it in a way that we're not going to lose all those resources, right? They didn't want to just pour all this money into housing without having some security that it wouldn't be a totally risky endeavor. So the Homeowners Loan Corporation was empowered to develop maps across the whole country of all of the cities across the country to determine levels of risk associated with investing in those communities. Because the federal government said, we're going to do 30-year fixed rate mortgages. This was not a thing. This is not a thing before the National Housing Act. You could get a private mortgage through a bank, but a federally backed 30-year fixed rate mortgage, that came about because of the New Deal. What many of us today consider to be sort of the norm or the standard for buying a house didn't exist until this law came into being. So what did the Homeowners Loan Corporation do? They created maps. This is the map for the central LA region. You'll see 4 colors on this map. There's green, blue, yellow, and red. The green areas were determined to have the least amount of risk. They were go for it, green light, go ahead, federally backed mortgages, A-OK, right? Not a problem. These communities will be stable and it will be an investment with zero risk involved. The blue areas, a little bit of risk. But for the most part, the Homeowners Loan Corporation determined the risk was not that high and that this was still sufficiently risk low enough that federally backed mortgages would be not that much of a risky endeavor in these communities. The yellow areas, substantial risk. And it would be much, much harder for folks looking to buy a home to receive a federally backed mortgage in the areas that were yellow. And then we have the red areas, or typically referred to as red-lined areas, which you could not get a federally backed mortgage in these communities. Now, to be fair, most of these communities were redlined because they were racially mixed, as we'll see in just a little bit. And so there were all kinds of other things coming into play as well. Redlining wasn't the one and only reason that people could not purchase federally backed mortgages in these communities, but it was a significant sort of imprimatur of the government saying, here's an area we can invest and here's an area we cannot invest. So let's look just a little bit at how they came to these determinations of green, blue, yellow, and red. We'll look at two areas just a mile apart, 2 miles actually. This area right next to Runyon Canyon, area in Central Hollywood I've circled in red. So the description of the area next to Runyon Canyon was that they had a moderately increasing population with business and professional men who with annual incomes of $3,600 a year and upward, 0% foreign families, no nationalities, 0% Negro, and no apparent or anticipated shifting or infiltration. This is the top line description, right? Every area had a single page description. This is the top of the page. Here's the bottom of the page. That the lots have minimum frontage of 100 feet, blah, blah, blah. It says then, provisions also protect against subversive racial hazards. Zoning also limits construction in the area to single-family dwellings. These two things are directly connected. They don't say that, but they are. And then they also say at the bottom, population is homogeneous. We should know, we should be clear, that when the Homeowners Loan Corporation describes this community next to Runyon Canyon as being protected against subversive racial hazards, what they're saying is all of these homes have covenants. They have racially restrictive covenants on these homes that limit them to only being white home buyers and white people that can purchase either property where there's not yet a home that they want to build one, or if they're going to be reselling a home. And that also is what they mean by population is homogeneous. Now, in contrast, we'll look at the area around Central Hollywood, just a little over a mile, almost 2 miles away. They describe the population is slightly increasing with white-collar workers, annual incomes of $1,202 a year, 15% foreign families, Orientals and Mexicans, and few percent Negro. But then they say also, infiltration of Orientals is increasing. The encroachment of business and industry is also a threat. At the bottom of this page, they describe the area as generally of poor quality and population is extremely heterogeneous. We should note that is not a good thing in the eyes of the Homeowners Loan Corporation, and the population includes many subversive racial and social elements. They go on to say toward the bottom here that were it not for a scattering of Japanese and Filipino residents, this section would be entitled to a higher grade. Let me just reiterate that. Were it not for a scattering of Japanese and Filipino residents, this section would be entitled to not be red, but to be yellow, right? So they're saying that the handful of people who are of Japanese and Filipino descent makes this community ineligible to receive a federally backed mortgage if you wanted to purchase a home in this community. It is very hard, I think, to overstate the implications when a handful of people here or there determine the opportunity available to everyone to invest in their community, and what that does to a community and how people perceive threats and risk when it comes to an area where they would themselves want to live or invest in or own a home. And I think we don't really have the time to dive into that, but I really want people to kind of think about what that meant for people who were looking to buy homes at the time, who understood that having just a few people of Japanese or Filipino descent or whatever, more than a few percent Negro, meant that their community was going to be redlined, right? So the Supreme Court did overturn the racially restrictive deed covenants. In 1948, Shelley v. Kramer, the Supreme Court ruled 6-0 that they're no longer enforceable in a court of law. But a couple things I want to note about that. One, their decision, 6-0, 3 of the judges had to recuse themselves because they lived in homes with covenants that were racially restrictive. And 2, They didn't say they're invalid. They just said, yeah, we don't want to enforce them in the courts. So effectively, they still existed. And many people today across the LA region, across the country, but certainly here in the region, we still have them on our homes. They still exist. It's a huge undertaking to get rid of them on a large scale. And so unless people discover them on a case-by-case basis, they still exist in many, many homes across LA. I also offer this photo of Hattie McDaniel here, because Hattie McDaniel was the first Black winner of an Academy Award for her role in Mammy and Gone with the Wind. Congratulations, Hattie. But she bought a home in Sugar Hill in the 1940s. She bought a home that had a racially restrictive covenant on it. And she fought the residents in the community who rallied to kick her out of her home, basically, that she had bought. And she went to court. And her court challenge in 1945 was the very first time that any court ruled in favor of overturning these covenants, with 1945. So we've had now, since the mid-19 teens, essentially, this proliferation of these. It's not until 30 years later, 30 years later, think of where you were 30 years ago, okay? We're talking early 1990s, right? It's over 30 years of these being completely and perfectly legal and the law of the land that you can say, only white people can live in this home, only white people can buy this home, only white people can live in this community. That it's not until 1948 that they're finally overturned at the U.S. Supreme Court. And so around this time as well, you know, it's one thing for the federal government to say, we're going to give you a bunch of money so you can buy single-family homes, but even that, there's still a lot of people who can't afford housing, right? So the federal government is also investing significant resources in public housing. Subsequent to the National Housing Act of 1934, there was additional action taken at the federal level to create a bunch of public housing. That housing is explicitly segregated. It is segregated, white housing over here, non-white housing over there. This is the case for this public housing for years, and it was reinforced through actions taken at Congress years after we built tens of thousands of units of public housing. And in California, we had a little dust up, I'll put it, around the creation of public housing. And the California Association of Realtors in 1950 put a measure on the ballot, which passed overwhelmingly. And what that measure said was, if you want to build publicly funded housing, you have to get the approval of the voters. So let's say the federal government wanted to build a 200-unit public housing development in Los Angeles. The city of LA would have to first put a ballot measure before the voters to say, are you okay with this 200-unit publicly funded subsidized housing development? And if the voters said yes, then they could build it. Well, as you could imagine, this meant the end of publicly funded housing being constructed in California for years. This was an amendment to the state constitution that is still the law of the land. Now, you might say, but aren't we funding subsidized housing today? How is this still the law of the land? Well, that was 70 years ago when it passed. And subsequent to that, we've been able to sort of figure out some workarounds. Like, for instance, you may have seen on Measure HHH, when that came to the voters in 2017 in Los Angeles, 2016, sorry. HHH, both had a dollar amount and a number of units. It said 10,000 units of supportive housing, and I think it was 1.2 billion or some dollar amount, right, that was attached to it. That number of units was directly connected to Article 34, which is still the law of the land. And because this is still the law of the land, there's been some efforts to try and quantify what the impacts of that one piece of legislation are today. And it's somewhere between $5,000 and $20,000 per unit of subsidized housing, additional costs just to deal with the legal challenges associated with this. Now, there is likely going to be a statewide initiative within the next couple of years to strike from the California Constitution, which, to their credit, the California Association of Realtors has said, our bad, that was not good of us to do 70 years ago, we want to fix our history on this. However, it is still the law of the land today. And subsequent to that, we see what many people sort of colloquially refer to as white flight. And in LA County, of the 88 incorporated cities in LA County, 31 of them were incorporated in a single decade. from 1954 to 1964 during this period of white flight. And the real driving factor behind this was the idea of local control, of people being able to decide at a very localized level what can and cannot occur within their few blocks around their home. And there were three things that really sort of fueled this rapid growth of these 31 newly incorporated communities, this white flight across not just LA County, across the country, but in LA County, absolutely. The first, and I'm going to quote a guy named Richard Rothstein, who's a professor who wrote this book, really good book called The Color of Law, where he says, builders went to the Federal Housing Administration and submitted plans for development. Those plans had to include a commitment never to sell a home to an African American, and the Federal Housing Administration required a commitment that each of these homes have a clause in their deed both prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. And specifically here, he's talking about the development of the community of Lakewood, which is a community in southeast LA County that when it was constructed, it was a housing subdivision. I think it was about 17,000 homes that were constructed all and incorporated into this community of Lakewood. And he's specifically calling out how the Federal Housing Administration in the 50s, in deciding whether or not to provide resources to back the construction of this huge new housing subdivision, said, you can't allow black people to live there. And that was actually turned out to be very, very effective. As it turns out, once Lakewood was incorporated and had tens of thousands of residents by the mid-1960s, there were about 6 black families in the entire city. So even though these are perfectly illegal documents, right, cannot be enforced in the courts, because the court ruled in 1948 you cannot enforce these kinds of things in the courts, they're still functioning just about as they were intended to for the last 30, 40 years. The second thing that really accelerated this white flight era is the rapidly expanding freeway network, which we'll get into in just a moment. And then the third thing is contract cities. So we have a number of cities across LA County where what they've done is they've contracted with county sheriff, county police, or county fire, county libraries, whatever the case may be. They're not actually standing all these things up themselves. They're merely collecting the taxes and then paying out a lot of money to all of these other agencies to provide the services that normally in a city you might expect, like the city stands up these things themselves. And contract cities were something that were very once it was determined by the courts that this was an appropriate path for cities to move forward with, a bunch of cities incorporated under this model. So another quote I'm just going to offer here. The most common way that realtors kept neighborhoods all white, in addition to this local control that we're seeing here and the incorporation of these cities, but the way that realtors did it was through what's known as racial steering, where they would lie to minority buyers that a home had just been sold and expel or freeze out of the business any broker selling to a minority. So they would basically say, oh, to a black family that wanted to purchase in a community that was maybe exclusively white or almost exclusively white, they say, oh, I'm really sorry, that home's already been sold. This approach was so successful that the San Fernando Valley Fair Housing Council knew of only one black family that was able to buy a home between 1950 and 1960 in the white neighborhoods that dominated the San Fernando Valley, which is to say, across almost the entirety of the San Fernando Valley, for a 10-year period, one black family was able to move in. So white flight is not just white people leaving central city areas and incorporating their own local controlled communities. It is them basically creating new exclusively white communities in an era when the housing covenants and such were no longer able to be enforced in the courts, and so they found new ways to continue to proliferate or perpetuate this cycle of racial discrimination in housing. Now, this wasn't as explicit, right? Racial steering is not like it's in the books, like, oh, well, that's a black family, so I'm going to discriminate against them. So there's not like a clear thing like we saw with the covenants where it said you can't sell this home to a black family. It's just happening over and over and over and over and over in a way that is systemically racist. So I mentioned the freeways, and we really have to just acknowledge here that the federal government has a huge role to play in its huge infusion of dollars in the 1950s through the Federal Highway Act. So we had plans of building freeways in the LA region, but it wasn't until the federal government said, every dollar you spend, we'll give you 9, right? So every dollar that we then spent to build a freeway, 90 cents of that came from the federal government. So freeways became both a mobility tool as well as what many folks in the planning community would describe at the time as slum clearance. So freeways were gouged through communities that had been redlined and completely upended tens of thousands of residents across the LA region. Gouged through these communities and also along lines that separated maybe a green line or a blue line community from a red line community. And here we have today, just, if you go on Google Maps, you could find something like this just about anywhere in LA. This is the Western Avenue overcrossing of the I-10 freeway. But this is also Sugar Hill. So I showed you that photo of Hattie McDaniel. Sugar Hill was a community that was sort of in the 1940s and early 1950s was seen as the center of black wealth, where a number, after Hattie McDaniel came in and purchased her home, and it was a big deal, a number of other well-known black entertainers in the industry, in the entertainment industry, also bought homes in Sugar Hill. And then what happened just a few years later is our local planners had to decide between, for the I-10 freeway, does it go through Sugar Hill or does it go through Fraternity Sorority Row near USC? They opted for Sugar Hill. They also opted on the western end of the I-10 freeway through Santa Monica to completely gouge through the only really sort of black community in Santa Monica at the time. Completely destroyed the black community that existed in Santa Monica at the time. These things were not accidental. These things were intentional. Intentional. We have to be willing to accept and understand that if we're going to get anywhere in our conversation around housing. So you might be thinking, well, gosh, isn't anyone sort of doing anything sort of proactively to sort of change the narrative, to really kind of push us in the direction of we can no longer discriminate on the basis of race in housing? And in fact, in 1963, the state of California passed the Rumford Fair Housing Act, which barred discrimination in housing on the basis of race. Now, in order to get the law passed, it had to be amended so that it would only apply to multifamily dwellings of 5 or more units. So it would not apply to single-family housing. It would not apply to duplexes or triplexes or quadplexes. But anything 5 or more units, it applied. Well, then what happened is the Realtors Associations put Proposition 14 on the ballot. Proposition 14 was described here in this one version on the left as restoring to California property owners the right to choose the person or persons to whom they wish to sell or rent their residential property. Well, guess what? They've always had that choice. What Proposition 14 would do was to eliminate the Rumford Act from the books so that they could have that choice just on the basis of race. And you might think, well, gosh, that's a pretty shameful thing to have on the ballot, and not a lot of people really kind of lined up in big names or anything, kind of lined up in favor of it. It passed overwhelmingly, 65-35 across the state. And here in LA County, we backed allowing racial discrimination on the basis of in housing, 70% in favor of Prop 14. 70%. The LA Times itself wrote in support of Prop 14, one of man's most ancient rights in a free society is the privilege of using and disposing of his private property in whatever manner he deems appropriate. So this is part of, our parents were alive for this. This is getting to the point where our history is now, it's pushing right up into our present. And I offered the story there where Governor-elect Ronald Reagan in 1966 said that one of his first things he was going to do was to seek a repeal of the Rumford Open Housing Act. The bill went through the courts, and one of the reasons that then Governor Pat Brown was seen as having lost his re-election to Ronald Reagan was because he took Prop 14 to the courts. He said, I don't care if the voters voted for this, it's bad. It needs to be off the books. And ultimately, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in 1967 that it was, in fact, allowing discrimination based on race. Prop 14 was struck. So ultimately, Pat Brown was shown to be right, but he had lost his re-election to Ronald Reagan by that point. And subsequent, or I should say concurrent with this, we also start to see this constriction happening, what I call constriction. And you might see this. I've provided just a photo of just a building, right? That is known. It's a type of architecture throughout Los Angeles known as a dingbat. And this is basically where you have this like 2 or 3, maybe 4, but usually 2 or 3 story building with parking underneath, usually up on stilts of some sort, right? So they can allow for the parking. And very often, or almost always, they're very much of a period, right? It's almost like every single dingbat that you see in any of our central LA communities, it's like it feels like you're in a Mad Men episode or something. They all sort of look like they were built, as part of the Brady Bunch era or something. Well, there's a reason for that. There's a reason for that. These became very popular to build in the mid 1950s. And shortly after that boom started, we increased parking minimums in the city of LA a little bit to 1.25 spaces per unit, which is to say, for every apartment, you need 1.25 parking spaces. So if you were building a 4-unit building, you had to have 5 parking spaces. Well, what that did then is that architects who were supporting efforts to build dingbats around the city, they'd go backwards. So they would look at how much space was on a piece of land, and they'd say, okay, well, you can fit 10 parking spaces, 8 parking spaces, whatever. And from that, you could determine how much housing could be built. And we had pretty liberal zoning laws across a good portion of the city. So a lot of folks who lived in single-family homes were on properties where they could build dingbats. And because it was something that was basically affordable enough for them to do it, the type of construction was low cost enough that they could do it relatively easily and quickly. These were very popular to be able to build as a way for people to sort of make a little bit of money and rent out and create a new bunch of housing, right? Well, in 1964, the same year that we passed Proposition 14 overwhelmingly, which, by the way, was to re-allow discrimination on the basis of race in buildings that looked exactly like this one, right? Because it was 5 or more unit buildings only. So basically in LA, it was dingbats. This is what we were seeing everywhere, getting built all across. You hear people talk today about, these giant buildings that, don't feel like they belong in our city. That was dingbats. In the 1950s and 60s, these buildings, which today are essentially one of our core opportunities for rent stabilized housing, at that time were sort of seen as like, this is overtaking our cities. This is something that we don't want, right? But it's also, you couldn't discriminate on the basis of race in this housing. And that's the same year we said, no, we want to be able to allow discrimination on the basis of race again. We also did this little thing where we increased the parking minimums to 1.5 spaces per unit. Well, guess what? That essentially ended the construction of dingbats. And I offer this example because I think a lot of times we have this conversation around housing and people think, well, zoning, we're going to all get into zoning and zoning. Every piece of the zoning code, it's not just a function of some sort of technocratical thing. There are emotional and all kinds of societal things that are tied into these decisions that have far-reaching implications that we have to be able to sort of pull these things apart. We have to be able to tease these things out and understand why they exist, what created them, and what function they serve today, or if they should just be changed altogether. And in 1968, the federal government said, enough. We passed the Fair Housing Act at the federal level, which says you can no longer discriminate on the basis of race in housing. Which you might think, well, goodness, we finally did it. But you should know that this bill has been described as the most filibustered bill in the history of the Senate. And furthermore, it only was no longer filibustered once Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. It was days after his assassination that the filibuster was finally dropped on this bill, and it finally was allowed to proceed. It's also worth noting that at that time, in 1968, only 11% of federally backed mortgages had gone to lower and middle class neighborhoods. which is to say that almost 90% of federally backed mortgages had gone to upper income neighborhoods, which, as a friend of mine used to say, you bet your bippies, they were exclusively white. So housing has been directly tied to the civil rights movement since forever. It has been absolutely connected to this all throughout. And just 2 years after the federal government says you can't discriminate on the basis of race, we pass a law here in California, which I'm just acknowledging. We're not going to do a deep dive into CEQA by any stretch. But the California Environmental Quality Act, we passed this in 1970, signed into law by Ronald Reagan, which initially applied just to large municipal projects. But it was very quickly expanded through the courts within just 2 years to apply to every single new bit of construction. And for decades, this law has been used to curtail new housing construction, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a little bit. So we have this period of constriction that really sort of takes hold in the mid-1960s and really sort of, it starts to accelerate in the 70s. And LA City Council President John Gibson said to a number of to the city council when they were voting on some neighborhood zoning changes that were being requested, he says, what you're doing exactly, and I think you know it, is instead of giving people a chance to move around the city and be able to buy a single residential lot, you've decided the house has to be on a larger lot and is therefore more expensive. You've made it impossible to do anything but just make the ghetto larger. That's exactly what you've done. So we have community plans all across the city of Los Angeles. And in this case, there were a number of community plans on the west side where they were proposing, and they approved, increasing the minimum lot size. If you've never heard the terminology minimum lot size, consider yourself lucky. But essentially it means that any one lot has to be at least fill in the blank square footage, right? That's what minimum lot size means. So if you're going to build a house, you have to have however many square feet on that lot just to be able to build one home. These are completely arbitrary. And what he's saying here is through the community plan updates that were coming through that were approved at LA City Council in 1973 for some of these community plans on the west side, that was that by them increasing the minimum lot size, what they were doing is simply making it harder for people with fewer means available to them to actually be able to live in these communities. And he was right. We also saw the end of early public housing, because once we passed the Fair Housing Act in 1968, guess what? You cannot discriminate on the basis of race in federally funded housing, right? So all of that federally funded housing that we saw being built in the 40s, 50s, 60s, which in California really kind of came to an end with Article 34 in 1950, but was still proliferating across the rest of the country, was explicitly racially segregated in most places in the country, even up until this time, no longer could be done in 1968. And just a few years later, we just said, well, we're just done building that housing. And then we have this period of urban renewal. And in Los Angeles, what did that mean? Well, here is a picture of a neighborhood that no longer exists. This neighborhood was redlined in the 1930s because it was so racially mixed. Because it was so culturally and ethnically mixed, it was considered far too risky for the federal government to provide federally backed mortgages to this community. This was Bunker Hill. This is Bunker Hill subsequently, where we decided during the period of urban renewal to just literally tear out every single home and actually flatten the hill. Believe it or not, we actually flattened Bunker Hill in order to build the Civic Center, the Music Center, LA Department of Water and Power. That's where Walt Disney Concert Hall is now. It's where the new Bunker Hill redevelopment is going on. It was completely great. But at one time, it was one of our oldest communities and most racially mixed communities in Los Angeles. It was not until the Community Reinvestment Act of 1977 that we finally put a stop to redlining. This was the only time that we finally made it illegal to use these maps to determine if you get a federally backed mortgage in various communities. But it was just 1 year later, here in California, passed Prop 13. And as we know, based on this history, virtually all of the homeowners in California at the time were white. And what Prop 13 did was bake in the advantage, the financial advantage that folks who were homeowners had, at that time in perpetuity. It locked in property taxes at a certain level for folks who were homeowners, and made those taxes locked in at that level in perpetuity. And we now see incredible effects as a result of that 40 some odd years later. Incredible is not a word I'm using in a positive sense here, but one of the things that has been particularly remarkable as a result of Prop 13 is where the state used to rely significantly on property taxes to be able to pay for things like education, our roads, our health services. Now the state relies substantially on sales taxes and income taxes. And to the state's credit, our income taxes are very tilted toward much higher income taxes on the wealthy. But sales taxes, as we know, are tilted in completely the opposite direction. And so combined with sort of a wash, but if it was not for Prop 13, the state would probably be reliant much more on property taxes, which would, if property taxes combined with income taxes, the state would be much more progressive in its tax policy, but because of Prop 13, that is not possible. And in Los Angeles, we went even further with the passage of Proposition U in 1986. This was something that Zev Yaroslavsky, who was a city council member at the time, pictured on the lower left-hand corner there, went on to be a county supervisor. He put this on the ballot. And it was largely seen as a response to some of the developments that I've depicted on the top here. The West Side Pavilion, the Fujita building in Encino, and the Beverly Center in West LA, which were, people were like, oh my gosh, these behemoths are getting built all across LA. Well, 3 buildings in a 490 square mile city, but okay, all across the city. And what Proposition U did was it downzoned every single major thoroughfare across the entire city by reducing what is called the floor area ratio from 3:1 to 1.5:1. So that is something that makes no sense to a lot of folks, but here's what it essentially means. A floor area ratio of 3:1 means if you have a 100 square foot property, you can build 300 square feet of development on that. You could 300 square feet of housing or retail or whatever. 1.5:1 means if you have 100 square feet of land, you can build 150 square feet of housing or whatever. So it essentially wiped off half of our developable space in the city of LA on all of our major corridors with one fell swoop, which eliminated, by my sort of back of the napkin calculation, the possibility of over 1 million apartments. One ballot measure passed in 1986. So this period of constriction, this period from the 1960s to around 1990, in the city of Los Angeles, just the city of LA, this isn't the whole LA region, but just the city of LA, we had in 1960 what is called a zoned capacity, right? If you were to build every single piece of land to the maximum allowed capacity on that piece of land, we could have accommodated up to 10 million people, which today you might think, oh my goodness, 10 million people, that's a lot. And you're not wrong that 10 million people is a lot. That would be about the same of people in LA as currently live in the city of San Francisco. So the city of San Francisco density today, if you were to apply that across the entire city of LA, would be about what we would have allowed under our zoning 60 years ago. But as a result of decades of constriction and making it harder and harder with increasing requirements around yards and setbacks, limiting our maximum densities, reducing height limits, increasing parking requirements, on and on and on, our zone capacity by 1990 was just under 4 million, which today our population is about 4 million, right? So we essentially said, let's get it all the way down to what we have. And there's been some very limited changes since 1990. Some community plan updates that have allowed just a little bit here, a little bit more there, a little bit more there. But Measure JJJ was truly the first time that the voters of Los Angeles said, we want more housing. The very first time that I can find that the voters said, we want more housing. And the Measure JJJ created the Transit-Oriented Communities Program, which is now single-handedly the largest affordable housing program we have in the city. And frankly, it's utterly inefficient to the need. But it's also the best we got right now. So I'm going to show you a quick little video
something that's clearly a scam, but Americans have been conditioned to believe is normal.
This. And this. And this. This. And this. Richest country in the world, and we choose to build our communities to look like this. This is so soul-crushing. You know what all these areas have in common? They're built for cars. We completely neglected public transportation and instead chose to publicly subsidize car ownership by building thousands of miles of roads and highways and parking lots. Also, those small town, like Main Street vibes that people like to glorify as small town America. Yeah, that like this is like illegal in most rural and suburban places. Zoning code literally banned the density required in order to build nice main streets like that, because density means apartments mean renters, and renters mean ethnics and poors move into the neighborhood. So if you're mad at this, then capitalism and racism.
Yeah, and if you don't believe me, listen to @FlyingTrashBag. But we're going to go now through how the history really has shaped our present. And first is just to note that for as much as we look across the landscape, we might see a crane here or there and think there's all this big housing going up. The reality is that we are building less housing today than we ever have in the last century. And that's really what this chart is showing. How redlining also plays out today, I showed you the freeway map. I showed you the freeway construction. Here's the freeway map overlaid on our redlining map. It was described by one activist in Boyle Heights who said, you know, we built about 70% of the freeways across the LA region we wanted to build, but in our low-income communities, we built all of them. We built all the freeways. Boyle Heights is now crisscrossed by 6 freeways, including a freeway that goes right through a lake in Boyle Heights. You would not find that in Beverly Hills, and you would not find in Beverly Hills in part because Beverly Hills fought and successfully defeated a freeway from going through Beverly Hills. You'll see a little stub of a freeway that comes down and actually turns into Alvarado. That's the 2 freeway. The original plan for the 2 freeway was for it to turn west and cut across Hollywood, Beverly Hills, and go out to the west side. That's a big part of the reason that there is no east-west freeway between central Los Angeles, other than the 10, and the west side. That the 10 is the one and only freeway that cuts east-west through that portion of the city. I've also indicated here with the blue stars on this map, this is areas where we still have today publicly subsidized housing that was created in that era of the federal government coming in and providing subsidized housing, almost exclusively in formerly redlined communities. Other ways that redlining plays out today, a recent study showed that formerly redlined communities are hotter than formerly green-lined communities, formerly green or blue-lined communities. And in LA, that difference is nearly 7 degrees. 7 degrees. So on a day like today, where in my formerly red-lined community where I live, actually it was formerly yellow-lined community, it's 90, low mid 90 degrees. In a formerly green-lined community just a few blocks away, it's probably 3 or 4 degrees cooler. That's the urban canopy, which is directly connected to where we invested with federal resources in green and blue line communities and disinvested in communities which were yellow and red lined. But across the country, this average is about 7-8 degrees difference. In LA, it's that as well. So on days especially like today, it is a huge difference for folks in some communities compared to others. We also find that our formerly red line communities, they're less safe to walk or bike. They're more dangerous for people driving. In no small part because our formerly red line communities, we made the roads wider and more dangerous and faster so that the white folks who were driving on the freeways to get out of town, their white flight communities, could get through these communities that were higher percentage black and brown folks, get through them faster. And as a result, the folks who live in those communities are subject to higher levels of danger walking, biking, and taking transit and driving themselves in their communities. We see today that homes owned by black families are appraised at significantly lower values than homes owned by white families. That's still happening right now. When I said we have a systemically racist system of housing in the country and here in LA, this is what I mean by that. This is only explained by race. neighborhood racial composition today is a stronger determinant of a home's value than racial composition of a neighborhood was in 1980. So we're going in the backward direction. We're seeing black folks, particularly in a majority black communities, have homes that are valued significantly less than white folks in majority white communities that are the same level type of home. And that is resulting in a transfer of wealth of billions of dollars from black folks to white folks. Because land, let's be real, land and property ownership is a primary way that we build and maintain and pass on wealth today. Parks in our formerly red line communities are half as large and 5 times as crowded in our formerly green and blue line communities. I'm using redlining red and green and blue as the shorthand here that folks that study these things today refer to majority white population communities and parks serve people of color. The reality is that our communities are segregated today because of decades of policies that segregated them. So I'm using redlining as shorthand for what a lot of folks today will not acknowledge as explicitly, but that's what it is. And also we're seeing this in policing. And a recent study found that our formerly redline communities are over-policed when it comes to social control and under-policed when it comes to emergency services. And not only that, but that policing responds to and reinforces segregated landscapes. We also see this with COVID. Now, this is not a redlining map, but if you can recall the redlining map, you might see that this is actually remarkably similar to the redlining map. This is actually the green and the reds on this map are the Cal EnviroScreen, which is a state analysis of risk around air pollution in particular for communities across the state. And in Los Angeles, we have some of the best air quality up in the Santa Monica Mountains, especially anywhere in the state, down in Rancho Palos Verdes. And we have some of the worst air quality. As many people know, they don't necessarily know we have some of the best air quality. They certainly know we have some of the worst in Central and South LA. And this is an overlay that the LA Times did back in October before we had the surge subsequent to that, which only further reinforced these issues. But this overlay shows the Cal EnviroScreen, where the worse the air quality, the more red the color, and the rate of COVID in the community. Those little dots that you see on the map that range from tiny, tiny little dots to big, dark dots, those are showing the rate of COVID in a community. And there's nearly a 1-to-1 correlation between exposure to air pollution and other pollutants and higher rates of COVID. These are directly related to a number of choices around land use, things like freeways, sewer, industry, etc., that make areas that were formerly redlined some of the worst in terms of air quality and also some of the highest in terms of COVID prevalence. LA is the 6th most segregated of 221 metro regions. We're just as segregated as we were 30 years ago, and we are more segregated than places like Cleveland or Philadelphia. In the city of LA, 45% of white households own our homes, compared to 20% of black households. So this is still happening. This is what I mean by systemically racist. When I say housing policy is systemically racist. Black home ownership today is about the same as it was when we passed the Fair Housing Act in 1968. And the gap between black and white home ownership is larger now than it has been at any time in the past 30 years. So I offer this map because sometimes people don't even really believe it after all of that. But this is from the 2010 census. It has not yet been updated for the 2020 census. But this is a dot map. Every single dot on this map, this is across the central LA area, every single dot on this map is a person that was counted in the 2010 census. And the blue dots are white people. The green dots are black people. The red dots are what the census designates as Asian people. And the orange dots are what the census designates as Hispanic. And the further the dots are apart, the further apart people live. And the closer they are, the closer the people live. That's all that the spacing of the dots indicates. And you can see pretty quickly that most of the areas with blue dots, they're pretty well separated. They're pretty separated, which also would mean that these are folks who are living in single-family homes because they have more land between their homes. The areas with orange dots, census-designated Hispanic folks, are pretty clustered, right? So those are almost entirely in multifamily communities. We do have in LA an area, a substantial area with green dots that themselves are fairly spread apart. We have in the entire country, some of the most noteworthy single-family majority black communities anywhere in the country. With Ladera Heights, Crenshaw, Englewood, South LA, we have a number of single-family communities that are majority black in LA. But again, this is there was a description in that LA Times article that I mentioned from yesterday where someone from the mid-19 teens, a black homeowner, was talking about how it's sort of like the white communities have been building these, what he called steel walls with their racially restrictive covenants. This is our direct reflection of those steel walls that weren't literal walls, but were functionally just as effective in segregating white folks from black folks. So I think it's just important to acknowledge one other piece here about construction and its implications for our housing policy. The California Legislative Analyst's Office, which is one of the most dry, drab places in terms of analysis that you can ever find, because they're so just like, these are the numbers, these are the facts, these are the numbers. There's no like nuance necessarily. They're very like to the book. They looked at this several years ago and they found that their quote, building less housing than people demand drives high housing costs. Now, that's essentially to say supply and demand applies to housing, right? Which for many folks is still a revelation. There's still this feeling like, well, no, we don't need to build housing where people want to live. They can go live somewhere else, or maybe we're not doing enough with the existing housing, or what. But what the Legislative Analyst's Office found was, no, you need to build more housing where people want to be. And if you look at these charts in the bottom, there's the one on the left, which is the constriction that I showed you previously. But then on the right, the one on the right shows the average housing price in California versus the average housing price for the United States. Because a lot of people will say, oh, housing's always been more expensive in California than elsewhere in the country, which is true. Because you can see in that chart, 1940, 50, 60, 70, you can see California's black bar next to the United States sort of pale bar. California's slightly higher. But subsequent to the 1970s, we completely and thoroughly decouple from the rest of the country when it comes to our average housing price in the state of California. So much so that in the last two bars there, 2010 and 2015, while the rest of the country was going through the Great Recession and housing prices dropped in the rest of the country, housing prices continued to increase in the state of California from 2010 to 2015. One thing that's important to note about construction. This is a chart that shows can be a little bit of complication. Charts, I think in terms of charts, not everyone does. I recognize that. So I'm just going to put that out there up front. But there are two really key things here. Along the bottom is the ratio of adult population relative to the amount of housing, which is to say, if you have 10 people living in an area and you have 5 homes, you have 2 people for every home. 10 to 5, 2 to 1, right? Or if you have 2 people living in an area in one home, you have 2 people for that one home. That's what that is along the bottom. So you see 1.9, 2.0, 2.1, 2.2, 2.3. Along the left-hand side is the median housing cost as a percent of the median earning. So for instance, we know that San Francisco, for instance, is really expensive, really, really expensive. We also know that the median income in San Francisco is really, really high, right? So this is basically saying, let's not just only look at income or only look at housing. Let's look at them combined. Right? We know that, for instance, LA, our housing costs are not nearly as high as San Francisco's. However, our median incomes are significantly lower than San Francisco's. So if you were in an area where, let's say, the average income was $100, but the average housing cost was $50, then that is 50% of that 100, right? And you would expect something along the 50% line. And that's what I mean by when you see the 25, 35, 45, 55, 65. In LA, we're all the way to the right-hand side. This is the 30 largest metropolitan areas in the entire country. There aren't any larger areas. There's none that are skipped. This is all of them. All 30 of the largest metropolitan areas in the country are plotted on this map, on this chart. LA, we're all the way out on the right-hand side, which is to say we have more adults per unit of housing than anywhere in the country. In other words, we have fewer homes for the number of people we have living here than anywhere in the country. We also are higher up on the chart than any other city in the country, which is to say our housing costs are higher as a share of our income, our average incomes, than anywhere in the country. Than anywhere in the country. We are all the way exception to the rule, all the way to the upper right-hand side of this chart. Worse than San Diego, worse than San Francisco, worse than New York City, worse than Sacramento, worse than Phoenix, worse than Portland, worse than Denver. We're it. We're it. And in fact, for our metropolitan area, which by the way, when we say metropolitan area, it's not just the city of LA, it's not just LA County, it's a big glom of like parts of Ventura County, Orange County, Riverside, San Bernardino. It's a huge area, right? So there's a lot of people in here. But for our area, if we wanted to go from where we are currently to approximately where like Dallas and Phoenix and Houston are, right? Where instead of having 2.35 people for every unit of housing, we had 2. And instead of paying nearly 60% of our income on housing, paying only 40% of our income on housing, we would have to build 1.2 million homes in our area. 1.2 million new homes. Now, I say this because I understand and appreciate that we don't want to only focus on new housing construction. It absolutely has to be at the center of our conversation about housing in our region today. Because what we have accomplished over decades and decades of constriction and making it harder and harder to provide housing and segregating our communities on the basis of race and all of these other things that we've done to just make it harder and harder for people to have a home, what we have done is made it inordinately more expensive for everyone, and particularly for those with the fewest means available to them. And we are seeing the direct consequences of that now with people leaving the region, where we lost population for the very first time in our history last year. For the very first time. Now, it wasn't a huge number. It was like, in the City Valley, I think it was like 15,000 or 20,000 people. Not a huge number. And those were almost entirely folks who would be categorized as low income. So this is the direct consequence of policy decisions aggregated over a century where we are not providing nearly enough housing for the people who live here. I mentioned CEQA earlier, signed into law by Governor Ronald Reagan. The way it plays out today is that fewer than 1 in 8 lawsuits targeting housing under CEQA are filed by groups that actually do work in environmental advocacy. In other words, the vast majority of lawsuits in CEQA that target housing are by people who have shown no demonstrated interest in the environment, using the Environmental Act to fight housing. And the vast majority of those lawsuits are fighting housing what is described as infill, which is to say in our cities, as opposed to out on the wildland urban interface, which I've shown here. The direct consequence of our building further and further out on the fringes is that when we have these wildfires, which are getting worse and worse year after year, is that they're destroying people's homes. In the last couple decades, nearly half of the new housing in California, 1 million of our homes, were built in this wildland urban interface. That's not sustainable. That's not sustainable. We cannot continue to do this. It does not work. And then in terms of homelessness, which for many of us is why we come to this conversation, because we experience and see or ourselves have been homeless on our streets, and we want to do something. We want to do something, right? Or maybe, I don't know, whatever the reason is for folks. But our homelessness numbers are continuing to go up. But I want to call out a couple things. One is that the vast majority of folks who are homeless are neither mentally ill nor have substance abuse issues. And I want to say that because I have a number of liberal friends who are convinced that folks are homeless because they're either mentally ill or substance abuse, or that the only way we'll ever solve homelessness is with services directed to people with mental illness and substance abuse. The vast majority of people who are homeless in our region have neither of these issues. But I can guarantee you that not having a roof over their heads, not having a bed to be able to go to sleep in at night, has a significant impact on their ability to even just carry about the day-to-day functions of just going to a job, going to school, whatever the case may be. But the last thing I want to call out here on this homelessness page, which is one more example of systemically racist housing policy, is that the share of black folks in LA County of our total population is 8%. But the share of black folks in our homeless population is 1/3, 33%. There's no other explanation for that than systemic racism. That's it. That's it. That is what is happening in this instance. And the Harvard University Joint Center of Housing Studies looked at this just last year to kind of sort of figure out, like, okay, well, what's going on here? What's happening here? And they looked at all 50 states, every one of the 50 states, and they looked at both that cost of housing that I was earlier on a different chart where I was showing that we have like the highest percentage of average housing costs to average income here in LA versus every other of our 30 largest metropolitan areas. That's essentially what is the chart along the bottom here, right? What they're calling the cost burden rate. Thank you, Harvard University Joint Center for Housing Studies, for something that no layperson would ever be able to discern. But then along the left-hand side, going from the bottom to the top, 0, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, is a calculation of the numbers of people experiencing homelessness. And what they find is a direct correlation between how expensive it is to live in a community and the numbers of folks who are homeless. That's essentially what this chart is showing us. The harder it is to afford a home in a community, the more likely and the higher numbers of folks you're going to find who are homeless. So Dorothy Walker, who is the founder of the American Planning Association, had a couple choice quotes that she provided in a op-ed she did last year. The first was that the very people who support progressive change elsewhere use local control of land use to prevent structural changes in their communities that would advance the cause of racial justice. And we should note, she was writing this largely in response to what we've been seeing over the last year plus, Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd and other racial reckoning, sort of the marches and the work that's been happening to organize folks across the country. She was saying, look, if you want to create change in your community, you can't just say you want it. You can't just put a flag up that says Black Lives Matter. At the same time, have another sign next door to that says, don't tear down my single family community or whatever, or don't build a building across the street that's going to replace a parking lot with a 4 or 5 story building that's going to block my view or something. You can't, if Black Lives Matter to you, you can't also then prevent changes in the community that would allow for more people to live in your community. And that's what she's sort of getting at here in the second piece, which is, as long as the people who own land and are already housed have total control over growth and change in their communities, we will never achieve true racial justice and social equity. We need to center folks who need housing the most. And the way our planning works right now, we center the people who already are the most comfortably housed of anyone. So I'm offering just a couple little types of housing you can sort of see here from, this is that pink and blue map I showed at sort of the start of the presentation. This is depicting a few communities, the Encino Hills in the upper left, Northern San Fernando Valley upper right, Condo Canyon near UCLA in the lower left, and Westlake MacArthur Park in the lower right. Each of those communities has these numbers tied to it. You might go, whoa, what am I looking at now? What are these weird numbers? Well, these are numbers that I'm pulling here just to show you that in the Encino Hills, the average household income is $202,000. In Northern San Fernando Valley, that number is $63,000. In Condo Canyon, the average household income is $122,000, and in Westlake, the average household income is $28,000. So you see some pretty stark differences. But then what are these other numbers, the 82.6, 87? That's the average lifespan of someone in that community. So you'll see that these numbers vary, right? For folks in Westlake MacArthur Park, the average lifespan is somewhere in the mid 70s that they'll live to be. Folks in Condo Camp, folks in Encino Hills, it's in the mid 80s. The single greatest determinant of someone's lifespan is their zip code. That's the single greatest determinant of how long you're going to live, is where you live. So when folks say, we don't want those folks to live here, they can go live somewhere else, what they're not realizing they're also saying, or maybe they do realize it, but what they're not realizing in many cases they're also saying is, I don't really care if you want to live in my community that maybe you'd get to live a few more years. You need to go live in that other community or some other community where maybe you won't get to live as long. That's what's happening. So I think just to sort of tie this together, single-family housing has been a very successful affordable housing program almost exclusively for white folks. Not exclusively. As we have seen, there are exceptions to the rule. But primarily for white folks. Largely as a result of federally backed lending, which has allowed wealth building. Today we're seeing continuing to accrue at levels even greater than we saw even 40 years ago on the basis of race, with enormous tax write-offs, with the baked-in benefits of Prop 13, and this institutional agency and power where we give homeowners just this leg up in every decision we make at the local level. And I just want to tie this together, say this can't do it. This isn't going to work. When I say we need to build 1.2 million more homes just to get, to levels of affordability that are similar to like Phoenix or Denver or something, this isn't the way we get there. It's not going to work. So we're going to go through these next few pieces relatively quickly because I want to take some time for questions. But who's in charge around here? This is an important thing to understand. We are the largest county in the country. If we were our own state in LA County, we'd be the 8th largest on the basis of population. If you combine the 10 smallest states across the country, that would still be fewer people than just in LA County. Yet those 10 states have 20 senators, right? Just so we're clear. We have part of one. And our governance, a lot of this is about to change, right? We're in the midst of a whole redistricting with the new 2020 census. But the cities in the upper right-hand side, they're going to stay the way they are with 88 cities across LA County. LA County with its 10 million residents, 1 million of them live in unincorporated LA County. So their one elected representative is a member of the County Board of Supervisors, which I've depicted the County Board of Supervisors districts in the lower left-hand corner. We have 5 supervisors, each representing 2 million people. LA City Council, upper center part there, we have 15 city council districts, each one representing more than 250,000 people. So we have all of this governance just sort of splattered across Southern California, which, by the way, is by design, right? Remember white flight and all that incorporation. This is by design. This is not just accidental. There may be some things that are accidental about it, but this is very much by design. So how do you change policy when each of these 88 cities have their own city council, their own planning department? When each city councilman in the city of LA has their own approach to housing? Right? How do you change policy? That's the question. I'm not answering it for you right now, but I'm inviting you to ask that question. So our theory of change in abundant housing LA. We believe that abundant housing is key to 3 main things. Everyone having a home they can afford, communities being livable and sustainable, and addressing the urgent climate crisis. And in terms of everyone having a home they can afford, going back to that legislative analyst report where they said building less housing than people demand drives high housing costs, they also said affordable housing programs, in this case, like LA's transportation-oriented or transit-oriented communities program, the Measure JJJ, those have a role. They have a role to supplement broader changes that facilitate more private housing construction. So everyone having a home they can afford is one of our 3 key parts of our theory of change. The next, about communities being livable and sustainable, this was analysis from the Smart Prosperity Institute a few years back that looked at the costs in a municipal government, in a city government, for an urban environment versus a suburban environment. Every single thing, just about, there's I think one exception in this, but just about every single thing is more expensive in an environment where people are more spread out than when they're living more closely together. So cities have a vested interest in wanting people to live more closely together. And frankly, this is a direct rebuttal to when folks say, well, how could we have more people live here? We don't have the plumbing or the electricity or something. Well, the converse to that is the more that they go out, live out in, like, let's say, Inland Empire, right? Imagine a day where it's 90 degrees here in central LA. It's 110 degrees out in San Bernardino. And guess what? They're going to want to have that air conditioning cranked all the way to the hilt. And guess what? We're all on that power grid. So having more folks living further out in the urban fringes, in the suburban fringes, that puts a drain on the resources that we all rely upon. We would be much better off with folks being able to live in areas where the weather is more accommodating, where they can walk to more things, where they can bike to more things, etc. And that's really what this is capturing. And the third part of our theory of change really goes back to the climate crisis is the issue that is in front of us right now. And the International Panel of Climate Change, I haven't seen their their more recent update to this number, but what they said just a few years ago was that in order to reach the 1.5 degrees Celsius target, which every country says that they want to do, we have to reduce our energy use in transportation by 40%. That means everyone needs to live closer together. It means we need to drive less. We're not going to do this with electric cars. If every single car was an electric car today, we'd reduce our energy use in transportation by like 15-20%. There's a bunch that is still baked into every single car that you can't get rid of it even with zero emissions cars. This requires a wholesale change in our thinking about these stuff. And really what that means then is what this article that just came out a couple months ago said: we can't beat the climate crisis without rethinking land use. Where they said after decades of sprawl, the US has the dubious honor of being a world leader in both building-related energy consumption and vehicle miles traveled per capita. So, our policy approaches at Abundant Housing LA, it's really, in my mind, all of it is a number of things, but first I just sort of want to capture this. People say, you're destroying the neighborhood. Tweet from the other day from Rick Cole said, hey, by the way, this is a single-family home. That's a single-family home. Perfectly legal. Perfectly legal. Because single-family zoning is not about neighborhood character. Right? We talk about neighborhood character. That's not what single-family zoning is about. Single-family zoning is about an archetype which restricts property so you could only build one home on one piece of land. But for us, our pro-housing agenda in Abundant Housing LA is 4 things: legalizing more homes, making them easier to build, funding affordable housing, and working to end homelessness, and strengthening renters' rights. These 4 things together, we believe, are the pro-housing agenda we need. They're an all-of-the-above approach, and they really center the needs of creating housing for folks who need it the most. So if you want to get involved, one of the key things we're still working on right now, partnering with a number of organizations that you see here, is the Regional Housing Needs Assessment. And the Pacific Urbanism put together this FAIR plan that we have joined on to support, which really pushes the city of Los Angeles especially to encourage more housing construction where most of the jobs are located, which, oh, by the way, is on the west side, and that's also some of the most exclusive communities in our region. So this is one of the things that we continue to focus on. Cities are having to get their regional housing needs assessment plans finalized, and we are pushing on this issue especially. You can also join us, abundanthousingle.org/membership. You can volunteer, abundanthousingle.org/volunteer. Donate, follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. And we encourage you to attend hearings. Your neighborhood council will have meetings where they're talking about housing. Your city council office, they'll want to hear from folks if there's housing projects that are... So this is something that's really important to get involved with. I guarantee you the folks who oppose housing are organized, they have resources, and they are doing everything they can to stop basically anything that can be done that would provide more housing in our communities. And it is incumbent on us to care about a community that is livable and sustainable and open to all, that we are doing everything we can to create more housing opportunities. So I thank you, and I am here to take your questions. Also, you can find me on Twitter at Luke H. Klipp, and feel free to email me anytime. I am happy to take questions and engage in conversation offline. Do we have questions?
No
No
one
questions.
has
That was it.
questions. Janet said, "Thank you. Great presentation. Thank you, Janet. Thank you for joining."
Thank you, Janet. Thank you for being here. We do have time. So whatever questions, throw my way. I'm happy to take any and all questions. I'm not shy. Well, prefer if they're around housing. But yeah, happy to engage. We get a lot of different audiences that have varied questions that run the gamut, and I'm certainly unafraid to take whatever questions you got.
We do have a question. So from Chad, is there a point in LA history when our notoriously bad traffic was developed as a result of policies?
I would say that I think our notoriously bad traffic has existed ever since we decided that cars were our means of movement. You can find historic photographs of LA, of our freeway networks, or even just roads from like the 30s, which are already completely congested. Basically, ever since we've had cars, we've had congestion. And ever since we've had congestion, we've attempted to resolve that by building more roads, by widening our roads, by spreading people out. And we have found, I think we could probably find, some people might disagree with this assessment, but we found that hasn't solved it. And while I think there are varying degrees of ideas about how much is too much congestion or not enough or whatever, we decided nearly a century ago that cars were the way to go. And within a few years, we had incredible amounts of congestion. And then we decided, well, because cars are the way to go, we have to do everything we do to accommodate them. So we started creating parking requirements. We started widening our roads. We started creating freeways. And, I looked at a study before the construction of 710 freeway, which found that the time to travel between downtown Long Beach and downtown Los Angeles was about 55 minutes. And so in order to address that, they built a freeway. But as someone who used to do that commute every day, reverse commute, not from Long Beach into downtown LA in the morning, but the reverse, go down to Long Beach in the morning and back in the evening, I can tell you that 55 minutes, if I knew that was consistent in my commute every day, would have been awfully nice compared to what I had. And yet, this is after we built miles and miles of freeways that involve displacing tens of thousands of people to construct them. So, we've tried to solve congestion through a number of approaches that I think we could look at. If we were to sort of really look at the historic record, we recognize that, the approaches we've taken have, the issues we saw back then are still the issues we see today, and the approaches we've taken haven't really solved that.
Thank you for that. So we also have another question here. How soon can the benefits of SB9, SB10, and other pro-housing bills be reduced?
How soon can they be what?
How soon can the benefits of SB9, SB10, and other pro-housing bills be, reduced or realized?
I'm assuming it's realized. So
Yeah,
for
it's realized.
those who are unfamiliar in this conversation today about what those bills are, those are two bills that have passed the state legislature and are now headed to the governor's desk. SB 9 is a bill that says that where we've only ever allowed single-family housing, now we can allow duplexes. That's what the bill allows. Now, a number of folks will say, well, actually it allows 4 units. Well, right, because currently right now where we allow single-family homes, we actually allow 2. We allow a home and what's called an accessory dwelling unit, which is typically referred to by some folks as a granny flat, or some people like to call them casitas. It's like a unit over a garage or something, right? Or garage converted into a unit. We have allowed that now for a number of years. But what SB 9 will do is say that main house, you can now subdivide that into 2. That is not currently law. because it has not been signed into law by the governor. SB 10 is a law that says if a city wants to allow up to 10 units of housing on any given parcel near transit, they can do that without having to get clearance under CEQA. That's what SB 10 says. It basically says it's a CEQA bill. It says you don't have to go through years of study and analysis and mitigation and everything else to allow more people to live near transit if that's what a city wants to do. That is also not currently law because the governor has not signed that either. Now, he may choose to sign them both, and then they become law if he does in January of next year. What we're seeing right now in terms of state housing bills having some effect on housing construction is pretty limited, but it has been largely a result of, I would say, SB 35, a state bill several years ago, which was the first time that the state legislature put some teeth into the regional housing needs assessment. This is something cities, I showed you in the PowerPoint, the regional housing needs assessment. Cities have done RHNA, as it's called. They've done it for 50 plus years. They've said, we need all this housing and we can build it here, there, or wherever, and then they've ignored it. And the states ignored it. And it wasn't until SB 35 was passed several years ago where the state said, oh, hey, cities, if you're not meeting your regional housing needs assessment goals, then any building that comes in that does meet those goals, you don't get to say no. And that bill has really kind of set off some fights, I would say, in some cities that are not happy about a state bill that's forcing them to allow new housing, particularly affordable housing, because they're doing such a bad job in creating affordable housing in some places where they've so successfully for so long been able to keep affordable housing from getting built in their communities. We're seeing a fight here in Southern California, just a few miles from where I live. There have been a number of fights around SB 35 in Northern California, but largely what that bill has done has allowed the construction of projects where they have 25, 30, 50% affordable housing within them. And across the entire state, it's been a couple thousand new homes that have been constructed or that are under construction as a result of SB 35. But these current bills, this current crop of bills, it's going to take years before we see any real tangible effects from them or any benefits realized as a result of them. It's part of the challenge with all of this is some of this is like there's a need to do stuff in the immediate time, in the immediate term, and then there's sort of the long-term sort of window, and there's in between the immediate and long-term window. And a lot of what we're seeing at the state level is discussion around sort of theoretical things years out from now that maybe if these bills get passed and signed into law, we'll actually start to see some results from them. I would note, I mentioned accessory dwelling units and how those are much more possible to build. That's as a result of state legislation several years ago. Assemblymember Richard Bloom has been really instrumental in that effort in particular, in allowing accessory dwelling units to get built. And in the city of LA, we are now seeing a significant number of new accessory dwelling units being constructed as a result of state legislation passed 5-6 years ago that made it much more possible to do this. And those are some of the most naturally affordable, I'll call it naturally affordable new housing that we're seeing getting built anywhere.
Great, thank you, Luke. So we have another question from Valerie. Can you talk about any recent successes for housing in LA?
Well, I mean, I did call out, thank you for your question, Valerie. I did call out Measure JJJ, which resulted in the creation of the city's Transit-Oriented Communities Program. And what TOC does is it says if developer comes in and wants to build, let's say 15% of the units they want to build in a project they want to designate for very low income folks, which is a specific category of income levels. We don't need to get into that. But if they want to do a certain percent, then they are given the opportunity to build a little taller or build a few more units or do a little less parking or build a little closer to the street or whatever the case may be. They're given what they are called incentives, right? And this program, this TOC program, is now the thing that is resulting in the construction of thousands of new units of affordable housing with only private capital, right? So, and I would contrast that with the city's Measure HHH, where we are investing over $1 billion of public resources in the construction of what will end up being somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 new affordable permanent supportive housing units across the city. Transit-oriented communities is almost at that same number without a single dime of public resources going into it, with entirely private resources going into it, and it's going to keep going. It's not limited like the TOS, like the Measure HHH, to just what we've already committed in terms of dollars. It's going to keep going and keep going. And the biggest reason I think that it's having that level of success, as it were, is because the program has such strong and clear incentives to people who are building housing that when they provide these percentages of designated low-income housing, they really they get such strong incentives as a result of that. And also the projects move through more quickly, which is a really important part of this, because the longer it takes to build, that's cost that is accrued to whoever wants to build there, right? The longer that they're sitting on land that they own before they can start to rent property on it or sell off or whatever, is expense that is coming right out of their pocketbook. That's the faster these projects are moving through is a huge incentive for folks to actually not just build what's allowed on the property, but to use these incentives to create low-income housing in their property in order to build their new housing faster. So I would say, really, frankly, that's the biggest success, I think, for the city of LA in years. And I would also just note, that's just city of LA. That doesn't exist outside of the city of LA. And in the region of the LA region, right, that area that needs 1.2 million new homes, that is over 100 cities. That is several counties, right? City of LA can't do it all by itself.
Great, thank you. Next question is from Janet. What are your thoughts about this scenario? We eliminated single-family housing lot restrictions and changed to enact land value tax as a way to eliminate Proposition 13, valuable or pipe dream. Pipe dream meaning my activists dream to put a dent in housing and address the volatility of the market.
Well, I do love the question. I think it's more of a pipe dream. And I love the question because it's like, thank you for asking it, and thank you for thinking that and thinking along those lines. And frankly, it's that kind of passion around this stuff and understanding of sort of what's going on that is what needs to be part of the broader conversation, even if it only moves incrementally getting there, right? It's important to have sort of the big picture vision about what it's going to take to really kind of fundamentally change the structures so that they're not nearly as, incentivizing toward sort of maintenance of wealth among white folks who got it from decades ago of exclusionary racist housing practices and just keeping it within their lineages, and start to just sort of bust that open and create opportunities for everyone. That kind of thinking you're bringing to the table is absolutely critical to that conversation. I don't want to say pipe dream, like don't go there. I think it's important to recognize, like, there's a lot of people who are going to hear that question and go, I'm sorry, what did you just ask? What's happening? And it's a conversation, right? It requires just like continuing to engage in talking with folks, organizing with folks, being in the room, and helping sort of shift the narrative.
Great. Next question is, can you speak to the future of HHH despite its shortcoming, and how it may still hopefully reach its goals?
Well, I mean, what I will say about HHH is, it's a good program. I think it is a good program. I think it's a necessary program. I think what it has run into is the same thing that every new housing proposal runs into: neighborhood opposition and zoning. And those things add time and they add cost. And that is why it's taking us so long to get these things built, and why we're building so much less than we had hoped to build when we first approved this in 2016. In LA right now, it's over $700,000 for every new unit of housing to construct. every new unit of housing is over $700,000. So, in a region where we have a shortfall of housing for hundreds of thousands of people, unless we're going to come up with trillions of dollars in public financing to just build all of this stuff, we're in a very difficult place. We're in a very difficult place. And I think what we're seeing with Measure HHH is a template for how we can kind of chip away at this. But we're talking about a ballot measure that I believe was $1.2 billion, creating just north of 5,000 affordable homes. The city of LA's annual budget is, I'm going to get this totally wrong, but I believe it's somewhere around 20-30 billion a year. I could be totally wrong about that, but it's higher than the 1.2 billion by a significant number, but it's not so massive, right, that we could reasonably expect to be able to commit public dollars on a meaningful enough scale to, over the long term, really, truly, substantially address our housing crisis through public investment. However, HHH is a good model for a way to do some creative financing and approaches to build publicly funded housing. I would also just note the units are not exclusively public funded. There is private capital coming into this picture as well. There's other resources coming in as well, federal and state resources that are sort of expanding the number of units that can be built, even with that money. And still, we're only between 5,000 and 6,000. But it's a one-time thing, right? It doesn't keep growing. That's the dollars that are available. These are the units that are going to get built. Once they're built, they're built. And we're paying off the bonds for however long we need to pay them off for, but then they're built. So that's really, truly the future of the program. The units get built, and then all that's left is we pay off the bonds.
Okay, I think those are all the questions we have.
Thanks for your questions, y'all. I really appreciate it. I'm going to go ahead and throw my my email back up on the screen so that you can check that out if you want to go ahead and email me. Follow me on Twitter. I have a few opinions about a number of things, not just housing. I'm happy to be a resource, connect with folks however I can be helpful. I definitely encourage you to get more involved with Abundant Housing LA, and we'll be back with this Abundant Housing LA the second Saturday in November. And at that, or is it October, Jamie? Is it November or October?
November. That's correct.
November.
Yeah.
Okay.
November.
We'll be back in November. Yes, I obviously don't think far enough ahead here on my calendar. But if you have friends, colleagues who you think would be interested in this, would have something to take away from this, please share the information, let them know, and encourage them to sign up for our Housing 101 coming up in a couple months.
Great, thank you so much. Also, one thing I want to point out, if you guys want to get organized with Abundant Housing LA within local chapters, we have about 20 local chapters within LA County. Please reach out to me. My email, I'm going to pop in my email address right here in the bottom, so you guys can reach out to me and see how you guys can get organized within the communities you guys live. So thank you so much for joining in.
Thanks, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your weekend.
All right, well, have a good weekend, everyone.